Hello friends, you're all very welcome along to the Dublin Festival of History. My name is Donald Fallon, I'm one of the programmers of the festival. You'll know if you've been here over the course of the day, this is the 11th year of the festival. It is the largest programme we have yet curated, with more than 200 events taking place right across the city of Dublin and online. We are delighted to be joined by Paul Duffy. Paul Duffy is a busy man. He is an archaeologist who directed numerous landmark excavations in Dublin, as well as leading projects in Australia, the United Kingdom and France. And he's not only an archaeologist and a historian, he's also a novelist. His novel, which is available outside, Run with the Hare, Hunt with the Hound, is set in 12th century Ireland. Now look, all novelists, of course, if they write about history, they have to imagine the world that came before them, but very few have been down there amongst it as archaeologists. He's published widely on the Crusades, and together with Edward Coleman and Tyg O'Keefe, is editor of Ireland and the Crusades, available here today. It is an ambitious interdisciplinary volume of essays from leading scholars published by Four Courts Press. And we're always keen in the festival to explore new areas, to, I suppose, broaden the horizon of the festival and its subject matters, and it's a real privilege to have Paul with us today. So a big welcome for Paul Duffy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Donald. Okay, so I'm glad that you mentioned that I'm an archaeologist first and foremost. It's my stock in trade, a historian with a very small h. So the bulk of what I do is directing excavations, and I've been on a number of excavations over recent years within stone's throw of where we're sitting today. But in terms of the historical research that Donald has mentioned there, it all harks back to a single event 20 years ago when I was an Erasmus student in Toulouse over in France. And I was researching the basically architectural archaeology or built architecture, and looking at the defensive architecture of Toulouse during the Great Siege, during the Cathar or the Albigensian Crusade. And fairly dry sounding topic, but during that process I came across an amazing source which is called the Canso de la Crusade, which is an epic poem detailing the events of those wars. And during reading I was reading the poem in the Library of Heritage over there, I encountered another Irishman, and he was leaping off the pages, leading charges against the walls of Toulouse, and he is represented somewhere in this picture behind me. So we'll get to that in due course, but that encounter, let's say 20 years ago, led down a particular avenue that's resulted in a lot of research, publication, events and projects. So much of what I'm going to speak about today derives from these two collections, one of which Donald mentioned. And instead of stopping at all points to kind of reference who's, I suppose, to credit people where credit is due, I've just included the relevant sources at the bottom of the slides. So do take notes as you go along. So as we are starting out on a talk entitled Ireland and the Crusades, it's probably a good idea to try to, in some way, define what the Crusades were. Much more difficult than perhaps it sounds. And this is just a very broad kind of attempt to put some words around what we're talking about. So it is a very broad term, and it encompasses a whole series of military expeditions that were launched, not just to the Holy Land, but to all sorts of places. But the central sort of theme is that it's the avowed intent was of preserving or expanding Christianity and the orthodoxy of the Roman Church. They were really a quintessential phenomenon, so very much became an unavoidable factor of life in the Middle Ages, in medieval Europe. So the question arises, was Ireland involved from the outset in the Crusades? What can we say about the early involvement of Ireland in the Crusades? And I suppose what I should say is that the term crusade and crusader itself isn't something that would have been recognized by the people who went to the Holy Land at the close of the 11th century. So we generally mark the commencement of the crusading era with a very famous council in Clermont, where Pope Urban II got into a sort of a furore of how would you say, religious fervor, and he called for the participation in a great endeavor towards Jerusalem, to free Jerusalem from what they were terming the Saracens, so the Islamic control of Jerusalem at the time. And that resulted in what's termed now the First Crusade, and we do have an indication of some Irish involvement in that movement. So we have Eckhart of Ora, who lists all of the people who were engaged in the crusade, and in that long and comprehensive list he does include people from Ireland. So I suppose that's a very far remove, however, from being absolutely certain whether or not Gaelic Irish people went on the First Crusade. And this source has been questioned by scholars. You know, is it just included in there to make the ensemble look all the more impressive, to make the point that people were coming from every corner of Christendom? So we're not going to answer that question today, but there's some indications that people from Ireland were engaged in the First Crusade. And then we have, when people think about the First Crusade, they often think about the fact that we have a piece of the True Cross in Ireland. And it's reported that in the early 1100s, whilst this crusading movement was really getting going, that the True Cross was brought to Ireland in procession and was paraded around the country, and that in the west of Ireland, where the High King, the reigning High King Turlough O'Connor, had his seat, that he requested a part of the True Cross that was granted to him. And this is the piece, this is the relic that's enshrined in this amazing piece of art that we have from that time, the Cross of Cong. And you can see the fragment of the True Cross in the center there. So it's thought potentially that this event marks a sending of the True Cross to Ireland on procession by potentially Pope Calixtus II, with the intention of drumming up support for the crusade. There are several ways through which Ireland is engaged by the crusading movement. So that's to say, we have this example where, you know, we could potentially read into this Cross of Cong relic as a direct attempt by a sitting pope to encourage people from Ireland to come on crusade. But we do know as well, we have physical evidence of papal communication into Ireland as well. So we know that in 1213, for example, the Quia Maiora papal bull was sent to Ireland with the express instruction of preaching the crusade to populations in Ireland by the Archbishop of Dublin and by the Abbot of Mellifont. So potentially reaching quite a wide population. Now whether that call was uptaken or was taken up at all, it's harder to say. But what we're looking at on the screen here is a papal bulla. It's a lead seal that would have hung from a piece of parchment, and a ribbon would have transpersed, or a cord would have come through the middle there, would have been tied up, and the wax seal would have sealed the bull, the papal bull. So we do find these things in archaeological contexts in Ireland, and this was found by a colleague of mine, Murray Callicon, only last year up in RD. It's in the region of 25 of these known from Ireland. And they generally seem to come up in plough soil. They're found in plough soil. So if you put yourself into the mind frame at the time, something that's coming from Rome, coming from the hand of a pope himself, was seen to have a lot of power, a lot of religious, it held a lot of religious power. So it's thought that these were actually deliberately placed within fields, with the expectation that would increase or bless the crop. So what you're looking at there is St. Peter and St. Paul, and St. Peter's sword between the two. And then the number of dots that you see around it, they're explicitly put in there so that it makes forgery very difficult. The recipient was supposed to know how many dots should be on the seal. So we have these tantalizing pieces of evidence, these bits of clues to suggest that the crusading message was being sent into Ireland. Then we also have, around about this time, in the middle of the 12th century, we know that there's a very close link between St. Bernard and St. Malachy. So St. Bernard of Clairvaux, beloved of the Cistercian order, was a key figure in preaching the crusade throughout Europe. He was also involved in preaching against heretics in the south of France. And we know that St. Malachy met St. Bernard in Clairvaux on his way on pilgrimage to Rome. And he spent some time there, and he was so impressed by what he saw at Citeaux that he returned to Ireland and founded Mellifont, the first Cistercian foundation in the country, 1142. Another connection, or another suggestion, that Ireland was familiar with this sort of wash of crusade rhetoric that was prevalent in Europe at the time, is that we start to see history presented in crusading terms. So in the first quarter thereabouts of the 12th century, we have a very famous account of the Battle of Cathar, the Cugagail Regalv. So we have Brian Boru represented as a Christian king who's driving the pagan Norse into the Dublin Sea. So very dramatic and very, I suppose, what's the word I'm looking for? Very clear cut, very binary account of that conflict, which was anything but. We know that on both sides of that battle we had Norse and Irish. We also know that by that time, the events are being described from 1014, that the Dublin Vikings were Christianizing or becoming Christian. They were certainly building churches before that time. So the fact that this whole thing is framed within a Christian versus pagan, I think we can infer from that, and scholars have pointed to the fact that this can be seen as an influence of this crusading rhetoric. We've seen also that Malachy was on his way to Rome on pilgrimage, and the part that pilgrimage plays in bringing back these ideas to Ireland is also very important. But we've got King Sitric in Dublin going on crusade to Rome in the 1030s, coming back and founding Christ Church Cathedral, which flies in the face somewhat of the notion that these are all unrepentant pagans, as presented in the Cugagail Regal. And then probably the closest link that we have between Ireland and the Crusades and the first flush of the crusading movement around 1100 into 1110 is actually, it kind of turns that narrative on its head, because the first crusader that we know of ties with Dublin that goes to the Holy Land is actually Sigurd the Crusader. He was a Norse king, son of Magnus Barelegs, and he had been in Dublin, and he'd actually been married to a daughter of Turlough O'Brien, Murcotach O'Brien, with the intention that he would continue on as King of Dublin. So it's kind of ironic that we have our first very clear connection between Dublin, at least, and the Holy Land is through a Viking. And sticking with that idea of pilgrimage, so pilgrimage really kicks off around the year 1000 into 1033, and it's reflective of basically the 1,000-year anniversary of Christ's death. People start to take a really strong interest in Jerusalem, going to see these places that are described so vividly in the New Testament. But Jerusalem wasn't the only place that was being visited by pilgrims. So one of the excavations I was involved in a number of years back over on Thomas Street, we discovered part of the graveyard of the Abbey of St. Thomas the Martyr. And within that graveyard we found two pilgrims. So two individuals who had been interred with a perforated scallop shell. One we found on the kind of abdomen there on the right-hand side, and the other one on the arm on the left-hand side. And both of these scallop shells are perforated at the base to allow either them to be hung on a cord or to be sewn onto clothing. And then, as now, the scallop shell is a representation, or it's an acknowledgement that the person has been on the Camino de Santiago, that they visited the shrine of St. James in Spain. Now, the reason I'm kind of talking about pilgrims in this way is that I said at the outset that the word crusade and crusaders didn't really exist at the time. What does show up in the sources sometimes, particularly with the Albigensian Crusade and some other sources, is that the word pilgrim is used to describe people who are going to the Holy Land, even if they're carrying weapons and they're going to war. And one of the angles in the book, Ireland and the Crusades, it's drawn out by Cathy Swift, I think is a really excellent, I suppose, interpretation of the sources that we have. So we know that Palmer, the word Palmer, is used to denote somebody who's been to Jerusalem and who has received baptism over there, either, and that they've come back with, as we have on Palm Sunday, they've come back with a fragment of palm from allegedly representing the palms of Jericho. So used very much in the same way as the shell from Santiago, we must have had people in Dublin around the end of the 12th century with palms, or sporting palms, or at least claiming to have been to the Holy Land, because they appear in the sources. We know of Aldred the Palmer, who founded the Hospital of St. John the Baptist just outside Newgate, which would put it near to St. Auden's Church there, the head of Thomas Street, really, just outside the town walls. But what Cathy has done is she's looked at the Merchant Guild roll, which is she represented there, a big long list of names dating from the very earliest part of the colony, the English colony in Ireland, in Dublin. And it's a list of names of people who have been inscribed in the Guild Merchant. So it's a way of tracking what was happening in Dublin, what occupation people had, where they were from. Now, the names don't always give that full suite of information. But of the 250 odd names that are listed and that have an occupation as a describer, as a descriptor, such as John the carpenter or Richard the tailor or whatever it might be, we have 82 examples of people described as palmers. Now, this is a sort of a mercantile document, so sort of at a loss to know why 82 people, which is by far the largest amount of, it's the largest profession represented in the Guild. It's about 31% of the named professions. Why are these being described as jobs or as a occupation? So Cathy has suggested that these are actually people who have been to the Holy Land and that are functioning as effectively strongmen for merchants. She's been able to pull out of other sources that merchants in this, I suppose, developing frontier community in Dublin, where you have the English or the Anglo-Normans establishing a foothold in what was a Gaelic country and Hiberno Norse country, that they would have needed, I suppose, individuals who knew their way around a sword, or who had been in, who had experienced conflict, or had experienced a tight spot before. So I think it's quite a genius suggestion that when we see all of these palmers listed, what we're actually seeing are people who are returning from the Third Crusade with Richard of England, Richard I, and they're looking for employment, and they're looking for, I suppose, adventure to a sense. It's leading them to a frontier town such as Dublin. So we've brought the Anglo-Normans into the conversation, and something that's been discussed and debated very thoroughly over recent years and into recent decades is how can we view the coming of the English to Ireland? Can it be viewed in the sense of a crusade? Can the invasion be viewed as a crusade? And we come back to this document, the Law Debilitor, that gave, I suppose, permission, a papal permission in some sense, to Henry II to come to Ireland and to conquer Ireland. And in that document, which was drafted and sent by the only ever Englishman to hold that position, Pope Adrian, in the 1150s, he discusses, or he mentions in the document, checking the descent of wickedness, correcting morals and implanting virtues, encouraging the growth of the faith in Christ, suggesting that all was not right in Ireland in terms of Christianity. And then we have much stronger language then coming from Henry II himself when he's, I suppose, trying to justify what's happened in Ireland to the Pope. He gets the Irish bishops behind him as well, and he's discussing the invasion as a means to extirpate the filth of native Irish abomination. That is extremely strong language, and abomination generally means, in a biblical sense, it means idolatry. So all that's discussed as well in the volume. There are certain elements of the Anglo-Norman invasion that can be viewed as crusade. And with them, the Anglo-Normans bring into Ireland the crusading orders. So we're talking about the Templars and the Hospitallers. So these Europe-spanning organizations that were set up to protect pilgrims, pilgrim routes and pilgrims in the Holy Land, making their way to the Holy Land, and who then became, as we know, sort of a Europe-wide phenomenon that held lands all over the place. And we can kind of see why it would have been attractive for incoming English or Anglo-Norman barons to grant land to the Hospitallers and the Templars, given that they had a military function. And that's what happens. So there's a lot of new land opened up in Ireland, and a lot of the barons do install these crusading orders, and they grant lands to them. And little by little over the years, the crusading orders get drawn into conflicts with the Gaelic Irish as well. So lending this, there's often this hint of, crusade, or this hint of heretical views, or at least heterodox views within the Irish, that the Irish are not, I suppose, true Christians in some sense. So again, there's a lot of papers discussing these issues in the volume. This is a brilliant reconstruction drawing commissioned by Dublin City Council and put together by Stephen Conlon, showing Kilmainham and the priory of Kilmainham as it would have been around about the 14th century, 15th century. So Kilmainham was the head of the Hospitaller order in Ireland, and I showed an image there previously of Clontarf. So Clontarf is a very unassuming church there, St. John's Church, behind Clontarf Castle, and that was the spot of the headquarters of the Templars in the country as well. So they had quite a strong presence. Now, the volume itself, Ireland and the Crusades, we look at a few other kind of myths and legends surrounding the Crusades, and a few other things that Irish people might immediately think about when they think about Crusades, such as the mummy in the crypts of St. Mickens, particularly beloved of Dubliners. And there's a paper looking at that. And then Dave Swift looks at this phenomenon of the crossed legs on tombs, which is often assumed to represent a journey to the Holy Land, that this individual has been a crusader. So there's a couple of really very important, very interesting pieces of information that have come out of that study in an Irish context, and I'll just have them up here briefly. You can see on this tomb surround from a tassel, you can see knights there that are clearly alive, they're in the quick, they're standing, and they're adopting this pose, this cross-legged pose. And you can see in the middle, that's from the great Charter of Waterford, again a 14th century document. You can see one of the kings of England, I forget which one of the Edwards, is crossing his legs as he's receiving the keys of the city. And again, it's thought that more than being an indication that somebody's been to the Holy Land, it's sort of a position, or it's a pose of power that was dominated, that was adopted by let's say, vigorous men in the day. And the last thing I'll say about the volume and the sort of interaction between Ireland and the Crusades is that so I haven't put her name here actually. Catherine Hurlock looks at the sort of the opposite view. She takes the opposite view where, as late as the 16th century, crusading rhetoric is actually still being used in Ireland, but in this sense, it's being used by the Irish against the English. So it's after the Reformation, where obviously the Protestant Reformation has been imposed to some degree in Ireland, and a lot of the native Irish and the Old English barons are looking to the continent for help to overturn the standing order in Ireland. And that's where we get the Papal Expeditionary Force landing in Smeric Harbour. We get obviously the Battle of Kinsale with all of the Spanish assistance. all of these, the lead up and the battles themselves are at times in the literature portrayed as crusades. So I suppose that was a kind of a run through some of the topics and some of the connections that are explored in our volume, and some of the maybe slightly counterintuitive ways that Ireland is connected to the Crusades and the crusading movement and the crusading ideal. And now we'll come back to what I started with, which is I suppose, the story that developed from my encounter with this individual, Hugh de Lacy, 20 years ago. And it all started in Toulouse. What you have there is on the left-hand side, I'm just checking that your left is my left here. So we've got the Basilica of Saint-Sernin, which is the largest Romanesque building in Europe, surviving in Europe. And this just shows that Toulouse itself, the south of France, was a very culturally important and thriving and opulent place. It had its own character, it had its own system of laws that were enshrined. On the right-hand side, you can see there the Place du Capitole in Toulouse, where 24 magistrates were elected magistrates would run the affairs of the city. So it's quite a progressive place. And there was a kind of a proto-banking emerging along the river of the Garonne there, where the weavers were very strong. And in this kind of atmosphere of this progressive atmosphere, there was an element of tolerance. And within that tolerance, these heretics, as they're called now, as they were called by the Catholic Church, took root. So to come back to that individual that we met in the pages of the Council de la Crusade, Hugh de Lacy. Now, I've shown a picture of Hugh de Lacy Senior, as we call him, for the purpose of the remainder of the talk, just to give a sense of what these individuals looked like. And on the left-hand side, you can see the only surviving manuscript of the Council. And this is the kind of thing that that Hugh's been described as doing. So he's riding around wherever they rode, fine blows were struck and defenders were overthrown. It's all very heroic and evocative, I suppose. So it was quite surprising to make that connection, like I say, back then. And I suppose the first thing that I needed to do was to establish whether or not this was the same individual that we know from Irish history, or if there was any connection between the de Lacys and Ireland. But maybe before we get into that, we can have a look at who exactly were the Albigensians or the Cathars. There's a high probability, thanks to Ryanair and the rest of them, that a lot of people will have travelled to the south of France, or maybe have flown into Carcassonne, and you get immediately get a sense you're sort of accosted by this the Occitan cross and these books about Cathars, and very much in the same way you might see the word Celtic or Celt kind of bandied around in literature over here when you get off the airport or you find yourself in a gift shop. So the actual truth of the matter and the reality of the Cathars is quite difficult to get to, and it's something that's always shifting in the historical research. But for the purposes of the talk today, I suppose we can just give a picture of some of the attributes that are associated with the Cathars. They were Christians, they believed in Christ, but they really didn't go in for all of the pomp and ceremony of Rome. They're very simple living people, but they were also very aware of Scripture. They spurned wealth and ostentation. They renounced earthly pleasures. They were vegetarian to an extent. Pacifism as well was big in their agenda. And they had this, they were called the good men or the good women. And you could become a good man or good woman by following the path laid out by the perfecti, who were a kind of initiated elite within their belief system. So they wouldn't have called themselves Cathars. It was something that was imposed upon them by churchmen from the north. But we do have a lot of information from inquisitions that were carried out in the south of France in the 13th century, and this is the kind of thing that you see people saying: the Roman Church is a harlot who gives out poison, and the power to poison all who believe her. So these are reported direct speech from inquisitions. The consolamentum itself was the one sacrament that they were believed to have, and it was a way of becoming a perfecti, or a sort of transitioning into that, the upper level of their belief system. Now, they didn't use water in that. They used a book, generally one of the New Testament books, and it was held over their head. Now, this is all gleaned from various different sources, but there's very little writing that survives in their hand. But coincidentally enough, one of the few codices that we have that has been of great use in sort of deciphering and piecing together some of these beliefs is in Trinity College in Dublin. It was identified as such in the 1960s in the collection of James, of Usher's collection in there. And this is what's in the Dublin Cathar Codex is effectively 11 tenets or principles that are laid out. And this is the first one. And it pretty much tells you, I think, all we need to know. The true Church of God is neither stone or wood or anything made by hand. The true Christians are themselves the temple of the Holy Spirit. So, we don't need a church, we don't need priests, we don't need any intermediaries to communicate with God. We just need to follow our own path effectively, and definitely the riches and the opulence of Rome was something that they abhorred, really. And then, by the same token, it wasn't very good business for Rome to have people who weren't interested in churches, they weren't interested in paying tithes, or engaging really with the church in any way. So, from the mid-11th century, mid-12th century, there were quite high-profile people travelling Languedoc, trying to disabuse these good men, good women, the bonhomme, the bon dame, of these heretical notions. And one of them we've already met, St. Bernard. He was in the Languedoc in 1145. Which is interesting, again, if you think about it. So we had St. Malachy, who was in Citeaux with Bernard in the 1130s. And he actually went back on pilgrimage to Rome, or he tried to go to Rome. He stopped in Citeaux again in 1148. So it was 2 years after Bernard had been in the Languedoc trying to preach to the people down there. But he got short shrift. He was fairly, they put it up to him in terms of the debating, and they were well able for him. To the point that he's famously said to have launched this curse against the town of Verfoy in the south of France, where he said, "Que Dieu vous dessèche," so which is effectively, "May God desiccate you," which is quite a hard thing when you're in the south of France. It's already a dusty enough place at times. And then you've got Saint Dominic as well, who was kind of the next generation. Obviously, these guys were not saints at the time. They were preachers. The sainthoods came afterwards. Not too long afterwards for either of these individuals, but Dominic was in the south of France around 1207, again, engaging with these people in town square, very open debates about theology. The fact that the preaching missions weren't effective added to this kind of pressure cooker scenario where Rome was really unhappy, particularly Innocent III, the Pope at the time, a very active Pope. And he kept sending sort of missions, and through his papal legates, correspondences, communications with Raymond, the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI. So I've just marked, to give you a sense of the size of Raymond's reach. You can see it there in green. So Toulouse is quite a large county. It covers a good part of Provence, Languedoc, a lot of what we consider the modern south of France. And we've already seen how Toulouse, the society in Toulouse was somewhat progressive. It was a little bit, some devolution of power. Now Toulouse was kind of nominally under nominally under the control of the kings of France. But there was very little effective control in the area. And you could nearly say the same. The Count of Toulouse had a wide reach, but he had let, I suppose, his viscounts and other nobles in the area a free enough reign. We know that there's some associations between the nobility down there, particularly there was a lot of noble women who seemed to be bon dame, or they were involved with the Cathars or the Albigensians. I should have said the word Albigensian just comes from a town, so Albi. It's basically, you know, Albigensian, so people from Albi, where it was seen to be quite a hotbed of these beliefs. So look, the crusade itself and how it was launched and everything, it's quite an involved story. So I think we can just simplify by saying that in 1209, Urban III, he launched the crusade by papal edict, and 10,000 people from all over the north of France and into Germany and some from England answered the call. And you can see why it would have been a very attractive prospect. So he was offering these plenary indulgences, which basically means whatever you've done, all of your sins will be expunged. If you travel to the Holy Land and you take part in these military engagements, you fight for Christ effectively. But obviously going to Jerusalem, you've got quite a long journey, a lot of expense, you've got danger, all the rest. Whereas with this, he was offering plenary indulgences just for a jaunt down to the Med, basically. So there was huge uptake, a lot of high-profile individuals, and they all gathered in Lyon and they went down. There was a lot of massacres and atrocities on the way down, as you can expect when you get a lot of I suppose fighting men together like that. And they took over Carcassonne, and the Count of Toulouse kind of skirted the whole thing. He sort of stayed aloof, and what happened in the end was Simon de Montfort stepped forward as leader of the crusade. They I suppose, secured Carcassonne, and the vast body of the Crusaders kind of disappeared after having done their 40 days. They had their plenary indulgence. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but that's effectively where I just want to leave the story there. We've got Raymond in Toulouse, you've got Montfort in Carcassonne. And this is just to give you a sense. So we did have, in the 13th century, you had the King of England, Henry II, or Henry Plantagenet, who had huge successes in France. And through marriage alliances and through military engagements, he succeeded in, I suppose, adding the lion's share of France to his lands. That was almost all reversed in the succeeding generation with Philip of France, Philip Augustus, as he's known. And you can see that the County of Toulouse forms part of that. Now, Henry II was mad to get Toulouse. He'd besieged it a number of times unsuccessfully, and as was Philip of France. But this crusade offered, I suppose, an opportunity for the northern king to attach Toulouse to his realm, which is effectively what happened. So when I was a student over there, I think the main reason this appealed to me to look at this in the first place was the similarities between the Anglo-Norman invasion and the Albigensian Crusade. So both of them, as we've seen, there was papal sanction for both of them, let's say. The justification for both, heresy, heterodoxy, we've seen the letters from Henry II to the Pope. In both cases, the kings declined to be involved initially, so Henry II doesn't come to Ireland, we know, until later on, and Philip Augustus doesn't come, his son comes later on. But they did leave liberty to their barons and their adherents to go and accrue lands in both cases. And in both cases, there was really an absence of a coordinated response from the Gaelic Irish and then from the subjects of the Count of Toulouse. And the result in both cases, imposition of a foreign law and culture. And in both cases, once the kind of hard work is done, the kings swoop in and they basically attach the lands then to their domains. In both cases, there's quite interesting parallels with the chroniclers. You've got Gerald of Wales, who we all know, and from Bernard's own Abbey of Citeaux, we have Pierre de Vaux de Cernay, who is quite a caustic chronicler of the events on the side of the Crusaders. But of most interest to us today is the fact that we have Hugh de Lacy, a huge figure in the Anglo-Norman conquest of Ireland. On the Irish side of the scales, and on the other side we have Hugh de Lacy, his son, as a key figure in the Albigensian Crusade. So we don't have a pen portrait of Hugh the Younger, but we do have one of Hugh the Elder, and most of you are probably quite aware of this individual in Irish history. We have a pen picture from Gerald of Wales, who, it must be said, he wasn't a friend of Hugh de Lacy, and Gerald can be quite caustic himself. But there are a few traits that are brought out that I think it's worth dwelling on here, as they seem to have passed on through the generation, as we see with the actions of Hugh II. He was firm and resolute, he was attentive to his private affairs, much experienced in military matters, and moderately ambitious of honour and renown. So this is the guy who built Trim Castle. He was the most inveterate castle builder we've seen in this country. He built castles, as he boasted, from the Shannon to the sea being the Irish Sea. He built castles for other magnates and other lords in Ireland, Mott and Bailey castles in the main, but also, as we said, with Trim stone castles. His son we know less about. We don't have the luxury of a portrait of him. But the fact that he was a remarkable individual is borne out by the fact that he was a second or third son. He wasn't in line to inherit. So Walter de Lacy inherits all of the de Lacy lands in Trim Castle, all around Meath, and Hugh was given a small area of land for himself. But in 1205, King John makes Hugh de Lacy the first Earl of Ulster, which is it's a really unusual occurrence. It's hard to explain, and I suppose to give you a sense of that, the importance of that elevation. John, during his reign, as far as I can ascertain, he only created 2 earldoms, one of them being this one in Ireland. And there were about 25 earls or earldoms in the kingdom at that time, Scotland, Wales, England. There were no other earls in Ireland, so all of these famous characters we know of, Strongbow and Hugh de Lacy and all of the other Norman magnates who came to Ireland, none of them were elevated to an earl. And the next earldom that was created in Ireland was to be about 100 years later. So it's a hugely significant event. But then we have, in 1210, Hugh de Lacy is effectively run out of Ireland by John. So there's a lot here to get into, and I'm aware the time is sort of slipping away. But basically, there's a letter that survives in the French king's records that we have, thankfully, that basically relates. It's on the left-hand side there, and the things that we need to bring out of it is, it was delivered by Roger des Essarts, and it's the French king speaking to de Lacy. And he says, regarding the war that we're going to declare in England with John, and you're going to basically progress that through your friends and followers, and also in Ireland you're going to progress that through your friends and defensive castles. It's a brilliant record because it actually tallies or explains some of the things that are happening in England in 1210 and Wales. So we have Ranulph of Chester, Llewellyn of Beorhwyth, the Lacys to the Browses, William of Scotland. They're all linked to this conspiracy, and I think that relates to these friends and followers in England. There's uprisings at this time. And then Hugh himself, he stays firm in Ireland when John arrives with a huge army, makes his way up the eastern seaboard. All of his allies, his family, Walter de Lacy, all his brothers, they all submit to John. But he retreats back to Dundalk. He burns his castles around Dundalk, Dundrum, retreats to Carrickfergus. And he refuses to submit. And King John advances on him with 5,000 men. He's got a few hundred combatants in the castle. And he holds out to the very end until he slips out, just before the castle is taken. He slips out a postern gate onto a galley and across the Irish Sea to Scotland. And we know that he flees down, there's a few legends about his flight down the length and breadth of England until he arrives probably in Paris. And we know in Paris there's a huge recruiting drive at exactly this time. And the next we see of him is in Carcassonne in 1211. And the story that unfolds is quite remarkable. So we have this letter that survived with the King of France's letter, and then we go back to this Cancer de la Crusade, the epic poem I mentioned at the outset, and we see that the first mention of Hugh de Lacy is in Carcassonne in 1211, and he's listed among only 15 knights that remain. As I said, all of these 10,000 individuals had evaporated, and de Montfort was left holding Carcassonne with 15 knights, around about 500 probably retainers and foot soldiers, and Hugh de Lacy and this Roger des Essarts, the guy who delivered the letter, are named side by side. Now the interesting thing here is that Hugh has found himself very much out of the frying pan into the fire, because as soon as he arrives in Carcassonne, word arrives that there is the Count of Toulouse is finally amassing all of his allies to try to combat the Crusaders, sensing that they're weakened. And curiously enough, scholars have estimated that the army of the Count of Toulouse is about 5,000. The council says 50,000, but we can take that with a grain of salt. And what happens next, the resultant battle of Castelnaudary was fought in accordance with what Jean Rochebert, his eminent French historian, has termed the audacious plan of Hugh de Lacy. So, the Cancer de la Crusade was written by two separate hands. So the first person who wrote the first third, we know his name, he was William of Tudel, Guillaume de Tudel. And about a third of the way through, he disappears, and a second hand takes up the narrative. Now, William of Tudela was a scribe, he was a retainer with the Count of Toulouse's brother, who had turned sides, so he was with the Crusaders. So he was in Carcassonne at the time that this was written. The second hand we'll come on to in a moment if I have time. He was from the opposite side. He was actually the defender of Toulouse, probably a knight in the employ of the Count of Toulouse. The amazing thing here is that William of Tudel was in the room when these words were spoken, allegedly by Hugh de Lacy, at this council. And if you read what he says, I think it's such an accurate reflection of how he must have been feeling at the time, that it's probably a very rare example of direct speech being captured in this way in the council, certainly. So de Lacy stands up, they're all debating what to do. Right, we're in Carcassonne, it's a very strong, it's a stronghold we can defend against the Count of Toulouse. But, and everybody's in agreement until Hugh de Lacy stands up and he says, don't shut yourself up in Carcassonne, they'll come after you, they'll lay siege to keep you there trapped. We've seen that in Carcassonne, or Carrickfergus I should say. Go to Fangeau and it will be the same. Wherever you go, they will track you down and you will be defeated and disgraced till the end of the world. So we can clearly see how Hugh might see himself in that situation himself. It's nearly as if he's talking to himself of a year earlier. Believe me, you should go to the weakest castle you possess, wait for them to come to you, and once you have reinforcements, attack. I'm certain you'll defeat them. So that's what happens. They ride out to Castelnaudary, which is midway point between Toulouse and Carcassonne. It's a very strategic point. And to be brief about it, they sort of, through feints and this kind of thing, they encourage the Count of Toulouse to attack before he's ready, and then they lead this sortie, this focused sortie out that sets them all in panic, and the Count of Toulouse retreats and they win the day. It's a very, very crucial turning point for the Crusade, and if they were defeated at this point, it's hard to see how the whole endeavour wouldn't have just evaporated. So Hugh de Lacy is the originator of this scheme. We know this from the council, but it's also backed up by the fact that he's then granted Castelnaudary and Larac, the very lands that they were fighting in. And he's holding that area, sort of midpoint between Toulouse and Carcassonne, as we've seen, very strategic. And if you think back to his father, you know, these guys are from the Welsh marches. They know how to manage borders, they know what to do in contested lands. So he's the perfect choice for somebody to hold that territory. And we know that he did hold it and administer it. Sorry, that's Larac on the left-hand side. It's a beautiful, very sleepy town now, but it was more of an important settlement. On the right-hand side, it's a 13th century foundations to the town hall of Castelnaudary. So we know that he was administering these lands because he granted lands, made grants to Dominic de Guzman, who was in the process of setting up a monastery at Preux, which was for Cathar women, effectively, so trying to rehabilitate Cathar women. And we have the records of the lands that were granted, and he also granted lands to the Hospitallers. And it was a Hospitaller commandery that survived in Renville until the French Revolution. And taking the charters and looking at all the different place names that are mentioned, this is more or less the area that he would have controlled, just highlighted there, crudely enough in red. So we know that he's there for 10 years, he's administering these lands, and he also continues to be referenced throughout the Council de la Crusade. The next reference to him, they're all when this second person takes over, and this second individual was more than likely, well, he was writing from within the walls of Toulouse. So it's interesting. What happens now is that de Lacy, we're not getting the reported speech. He transitions into a literary character that's being used by the author of the council as a counterpoint to de Montfort, to the leader of the crusade. And he's always shown as I suppose, contradicting what de Montfort is counselling. So it's interesting. I wonder, does that come from a knowledge of his character from his 10 years, in Castelnaudary, or is it just a literary device that's being used to show up de Montfort in some way? So I better hurry on here through these slides, but the culminating event in the Albigensian Crusade is this huge siege of Toulouse. Toulouse is a massive city. It's potentially as many as 20,000 people, dwarfing Dublin or anything in Ireland. Huge walls, very complex defence systems that have come from through antiquity. These are just some of the examples. Like I say, I won't dwell on them given our time limitations, but this is just to give you a sense. You can see the individuals shown there. This is what the Crusaders were facing. Huge fosses or ditches, and then palisades, and then these kind of areas that were maintained between the palisade and the wall where knights could be massed for sorties out to harry the Crusaders. And a lot of faith was put into these what were called passive defences. So these spaces in between the walls where they could gather themselves together. And this is a brilliant piece of sculpted. It's the side of a tomb, a side of a sarcophagus, and it's believed to be the sarcophagus of Simon de Montfort because during the siege, de Montfort is struck mortally by a stone launched from a catapult or a trebuchet on the walls of Toulouse, operated by the women of Toulouse. So the story goes. But it confirms what we've seen in the archaeology and what's discussed in the council. You can see that what I've marked in blue there is this palisade. You can see the kind of hosting area inside of that. And then you can see all of these defensive features of the town itself. And then in green there, what I've tried to pick out is the trebuchet being manned, being personed. And you do get a sense of the crush of bodies coming in. You see all these knights, the northern knights with their great helms, pressing forward. And you see, interestingly enough, the defenders of Toulouse are shown with these more kind of Roman-looking helmets. And then it's believed by a number of art historians that this, you see there's an angel there at the top right-hand side lifting out what looks to be a child. It's thought that this is a representation of de Montfort's soul being brought to heaven following his death. So really, after de Montfort is killed, the crusade collapses. So we'll just run through very briefly. He's killed by a stone, as we said. His brother takes over, and subsequently his son takes over, and they're just not really up to the task. And they're beaten for the first time in pitched battle at Baziège by the Count of Toulouse's son. And that ends de Lacy's reign as the Lord of Castelnaudary and Lorac. And then we see, as I mentioned, the French king comes to Languedoc and makes good on these gains. The Treaty of Paris sealing the deal in 1222. But that Battle of Baziège is the last time we hear the name Hugh de Lacy mentioned in the Council. And as I said, there's only one surviving manuscript of the Council, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And it has all these amazing, vibrant, action-filled illustrations, but unfortunately they were never completed, they were never coloured in. And, you know, de Lacy is one of the captains here, and it's certain that he's represented, he's one of these individuals, but we don't know, because the armorial devices were never completed, we can't say for certainty which one of them he is. But that wasn't the end of de Lacy's adventures. He did return to Ireland, and in true form, if we think back to how he was described, how his father was described, he's not happy. He tries to regain his earldom. He besieges Dublin Castle, and remarkably, he actually succeeds in winning the earldom back. And in 1235, he's at the Battle of Lough Kay. He's part of a hosting into Connacht, where for the first time in their recorded use in Ireland, we hear of these siege engines, these Perriers and mangonels, and covered fighting galleries that have been used. So that brings me to my last point, which is the legacy of de Lacy's 10 years plus in the south of France, on more or less incessant siege warfare, from castle to castle, from place to place. And we've seen already his pedigree, his father being, as I said, the most ambitious and wide-reaching castle builder in the country. So I believe that de Lacy came back furnished with a lot of innovative designs that were washing around the French king's court at the time. This Philippine architecture, as they call it in France, to reference King Philip. And it centres on these circular towers. So here's a few examples of them that are built around that time. That the Château Comtal there, Carcassonne on the right-hand side, is built just soon after the Crusade, and compares quite well with the gatehouse built by Hugh de Lacy at Carrickfergus after his return. And we see this circular motif again in Dundrum, built by Hugh de Lacy, and a clock Uachtar as well, up in Cavan, which is built by William Graham de Lacy, de Lacy's brother. And you can trace this dissemination of ideas through these other allies of de Lacy, if you recall, Ranulph of Chester and Llewellyn ap Orweth, who were involved in this 1210 conspiracy. And then, as we've seen as well, he's likely to be the person who brought, or at least at the forefront of bringing the siege warfare back to Ireland. I mean, none of his contemporaries would have had the breadth of experience that he had. And just a final point then, there is a sort of a tale to the dog, and it sort of lives on beyond Hugh de Lacy. He died peacefully at Carrickfergus in 1242. He must have been in his late 60s, if not in his 70s. We're not exactly sure when he was born, but he had a fairly storied life and a fairly good innings as well. But the young Simon de Montfort that people might have heard about in an English context, he's a very fated medieval figure over there, the first parliamentarian, as he's often viewed. He was the son of Simon de Montfort, who was killed at Toulouse. And in fact, this young Simon was there. He was there at Toulouse. He was there during the Crusade. He was following the camp around with his mother, with his father. He would have been in the company of Hugh, without doubt. And some unusual things happen when he comes to England, looking for restitution of his lands that had been in the family through his mother. And the earldom of Leicester is ceded to him by Ranulph of Chester, as we've seen, who was an old ally of Hugh. And we know that the two men were together at a certain point in time, because de Lacy signs one of his charters. So I've written about that in the volume as well, this kind of long tale to the story, whereby after all of his parliamentarian endeavours in England, he's killed at a battle in Evesham, and at that point he starts to be celebrated as a saint. And we have a brilliant record of a family, the Fipo family from Skreen in County Meath, who were de Lacy adherents. And we have a brilliant record from the book of the Saints book, Simon de Montfort, at Evesham, of this family arriving from Skreen to pay homage to Saint Simon de Montfort. They bend a penny, and they're asking for all sorts of cures for headaches and things like this. So I think that cult of Simon de Montfort was probably popular among de Lacy's followers. So to finish, you can say that Hugh de Lacy, his legacy in the sense of the Crusades and the Albigensian Crusade, he was Crusader captain. He played a very pivotal role. As I said, if his counsel wasn't taken at Castle Nowderoy, it's very unclear what would have happened with the Crusade and what would have actually the fate of the south of France been in the bigger picture. He was a landholder. We know that he administered lands. He gave charters. He was a religious patron. He was very much at the beginnings of the Dominican order. They were established in 1216 as an official order, and then, as we've seen, he became a literary figure, somebody who materially affected the outcome of the conflict. And then we've seen that there's a legacy of his crusade in Ireland, which probably still stands today in the monuments that we have inherited at Carrickfergus and elsewhere. So, as Donald mentioned, I mean, the sweep of the story, the dramatic kind of nature of it, led me to try to novelise this in some way. So that's what I've started to do with this book. I hope you don't mind me ending with that. Thank you.
I was trying to figure out on Hugh de Lacy from Meath. You say he came from Wales. I'm trying to figure out if he's a 1066er or if he's Welsh. And if he's a 1066er, what territory he's from. But apart from that, so he goes across, he ends up in Meath after Mellifont is in Meath, which is Bernard of Clairvaux. So the whole connection must be to Jerusalem. And we know that in 1080 or 1180, Acre, Richard the Lionheart, nobody is in Jerusalem after that, except those before him. And they're at the Solomon Temple, and they're Templars. And that's the link that you have to de Bracy, Hugh de Lacy, and John de Courcy, Templars, not Knights Hospitallers, not Knight Leprous, not Knights. They are the Templars. And they have whatever they've discovered there, they're bringing back. And John goes after them. And he's going to make sure they're gone because there's Jerusalem, they're not going to be there anymore. They're going to cost him more than they're worth. So they have to go down to Cathar, last bastion. And like the Templars of 1306, where do you make your last stand? And what's going to happen to you?
Thanks for that. I think you probably could squeeze the Holy Grail in there somewhere as well, no?
Hello, thank you very much for that talk. Thank you very much for that talk, Paul. A wonderful talk. I'm particularly interested in the Temple Bar situation. It's been denied for a long time that it's related to the Knights Templar. Yet in England, Temple Bar and Fleet Street is considered a key part of the Templar legacy in London. Yet we have for many, many years denied that Temple Bar is part of the Knights Templar legacy with the situation of Fleet Street at the start of Temple Bar. What's your opinion on that?
I mean, we have very good evidence, and I suppose I'd be quite comfortable in terms of religious institutions in Dublin. As I said, I've excavated on quite a number of them. And we have good information, we have very good cartographic and historical sources for those continental orders once they come to Ireland. And we know where the Templars were, where the lands were being granted. And there's nothing to connect Temple Bar with the Knights Templar. You know, it's your man William Temple, isn't it, the developer who reclaims land in the 17th century, which is, again, it's reclaimed land.
Fleet Street and Temple Bar, and that Fleet Street and Temple Bar in Dublin would not have a similar significance as Fleet Street and Temple Bar in London.
Yeah. No, like I say, we've good records for that period. And
So, friends, all that's left to do is to thank Paul Duffy for that beautiful talk. I thought that was one of the finest illustrated talks I've ever seen in terms of your own archaeological archives, your digs, the use of maps, historic artifacts, illustrations. It was a visual treat. It was fantastic to watch that talk. The book Ireland and the Crusades is available outside from the Gutter Bookshop. One less copy available now because I bought it. I snuck out I was enjoying the talk so much I snuck out to buy a copy. But there are many, many copies of the novel available, and I'm sure Paul will be more than happy to sign them afterwards. There's one event left today. Who remembers the Civil War? Planksty or Horselips? That was the question. Two great bands, of course, but we're honouring Horselips today because it is the 50th anniversary of a defining album, and we will have Jim Lockhart and Barry Devlin in conversation with Elizabeth Boyle in this room at 8 o'clock. So Horselips is our last event.